Behind the blinding flashlights of Hollywood's biggest stages, there lies a space where cameras never reach. In that suffocating darkness behind the velvet curtains, a singular shadow dictated the fate of a generation. The press reverently called him a benevolent godfather to artists seeking the ultimate American dream. But the boys who actually signed his golden contracts knew him only as a merciless executioner. This is the untold story of the ultimate betrayal disguised as glorious salvation. Welcome to the darkest illusion ever sold to the modern pop culture world. The winter of 1980 descended upon the American Rust Belt like a suffocating shroud of iron and frost. Across towns that had once forged the backbone of a superpower, blast furnaces stood cold and silent. Snow drifted against the chained gates of abandoned steel mills, masking the economic decay that was slowly poisoning the working class. The American dream had fractured here, leaving behind a desperate population, clinging to fading memories of prosperity. Men with calloused hands and hollow eyes drank cheap whiskey in dimly lit taverns, mourning a way of life that was rapidly turning to rust. It was a brutal landscape that demanded toughness, a place where vulnerability was typically punished without mercy. But there was a boy in the middle of it all who did not fit the shape the town had cut for him. His name was Jimmy Vance, though the locals affectionately called him the Chord. He was a painfully thin young man of 20 years with a shock of untamed hair and the nervous posture of a startled bird. While his peers inherited their father's heavy steel boots, Jimmy carried a battered acoustic guitar with splintered edges. He spent his frozen evenings in the corner of a smoky dive bar called the Rusty Anchor. He did not play for money, mostly because nobody in that town had any to spare. He played for a warm corner, a few sympathetic nods, and a couple of free draft beers. His fingers were perpetually blistered from cheap steel strings, yet they moved across the fretboard with absolute grace. To look at him was to see a fragile anomaly in a world of concrete. The marvel of Jimmy was the sound he managed to pull from that broken instrument. At a time when the airwaves were dominated by bloated stadium rock and the aggressive sneer of punk, his music was startlingly tender. It was a melancholic blend of folk storytelling and sweeping, cinematic melodies that felt entirely out of place in a gritty tavern. He sang about the quiet dignity of broken people and the aching desire for something just beyond the horizon. When Jimmy closed his eyes and leaned into the microphone, the rowdy bar patrons would abruptly fall silent. Grown men who had lost their pensions would stare into their half-empty glasses, completely dismantled by the vulnerability of his voice. He was translating their unspoken grief into 3-minute masterpieces, but the real secret is that Jimmy was singing to save himself. Jimmy was deeply intoxicated by a naive version of the American dream. He did not crave the excessive glamour of Hollywood or the flash of diamond rings. His ambition was heartbreakingly modest and rooted in sheer survival. He just wanted to pay the overdue heating bills for his mother and fix their leaking trailer roof. Underneath his bed, he kept a rusted coffee tin, where he meticulously deposited crumpled dollar bills and spare dimes. It was his escape fund, a physical manifestation of his desperate hope to cross the country to California. The West Coast represented a mythical promised land where talent was rewarded and hard work supposedly guaranteed a fair chance. Could a boy from the dying industrial heartland actually sing his way out of poverty? He certainly believed it with every fibre of his being. The turning point arrived when a local radio DJ played a rough cassette tape of Jimmy performing live. The switchboard lit up immediately with callers demanding to know the identity of the haunting voice. That tiny taste of validation was the final push he needed to pack his canvas duffel bag. The entire neighborhood gathered at the dirty Greyhound bus station to see him off on a freezing Tuesday morning. They pressed crumpled $5 bills into his freezing hands and slapped him proudly on the back. Jimmy was no longer just a musician to them. He was their designated champion. He was carrying the collective, unspoken hope of a town that the rest of the country had chosen to forget. As the massive diesel engine roared to life, he smiled through the frosted glass window. He watched the rusting water towers of his childhood fade into the grey winter distance. Jimmy sincerely believed he was heading toward a meritocratic paradise, where artists were nurtured and protected. He thought he was escaping the brutal machinery of the steel mills for something beautiful and humane. He was unaware that the music industry was just a different kind of factory, one that consumed human souls instead of iron ore. The American dream he chased was nothing more than a carefully orchestrated mirage. What happened next will surprise you. The neon signs of Los Angeles bleed into the midnight fog like a warning nobody bothers to read. By 2 a.m, the city sheds its glittering Hollywood skin and reveals a hungrier underbelly. Jimmy sat in a booth at a 24-hour diner just off Sunset Boulevard, nursing a lukewarm black coffee. He was exhausted by the relentless pace of a metropolis that demanded everything and promised nothing. The rusty dreams of his hometown felt incredibly distant beneath the flickering fluorescent lights and the heavy scent of stale grease. He was just another desperate kid with a guitar case, waiting for a miracle that rarely comes to places smelling of fried onions. The ambient clatter of silverware masked the quiet desperation echoing in his exhausted mind. Then the diner bell chimed, bringing in a man who simply did not belong in a room full of insomniacs and weary truck drivers. Richard Sterling moved with the quiet grace of a predator who had already memorized the layout of the cage. He wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit that absorbed the harsh diner lighting rather than reflecting it. Sterling did not look like the traditional industry vultures depicted in cinematic lore. He projected the warm authority of a benevolent uncle, arriving just in time to rescue a lost nephew from the rain. Sliding into the vinyl booth across from the bewildered musician, he ordered the most expensive steak on the menu and slid it directly toward Jimmy. It was a calculated gesture designed to completely disarm a starving artist. Between hungry bites of hot food, Jimmy consumed every honeyed word pouring effortlessly from the older man. Richard spoke softly about artistic integrity, generational talent, and the tragic way the industry usually chewed up brilliant boys from the industrial heartland. He knew exactly which emotional buttons to press to make the young man feel uniquely seen. This was the classic Los Angeles diner ambush, a psychological masterpiece painted on a sticky formica table. The manager did not promise immediate stadium tours or unearned wealth. Instead, he promised absolute protection from the very machinery he secretly represented. For a lonely kid far removed from the cold winters of his childhood, this fatherly warmth was intoxicating. The meal acted as a physical manifestation of a spiritual rescue. The conversation lulled into a comfortable silence, making the young musician feel entirely secure in this newfound brotherhood. But here is where it gets interesting. Richard smoothly unlatched his leather briefcase and produced a dense stack of legal documents. 50 pages of intricate legalese dropped onto the table with a soft thud next to the empty dinner plate. The paper was crisp, blindingly white, and filled with clauses designed by expensive Manhattan attorneys to legally strip a human being of their autonomy. Richard casually clicked an expensive fountain pen, waving away the dense paragraphs as mere industry formalities needed to get the ball rolling. He spoke of the contract not as a binding chain, but as a golden key to the recording studio. Did Jimmy understand a single sentence within that labyrinth of corporate vocabulary? No. Blinded by the sudden illusion of the grand American dream, he never considered calling a lawyer to review the paperwork. In his naive mind, demanding legal counsel would insult the generous man who had just fed him and promised him the world. Jimmy grabbed the heavy pen and eagerly scratched his signature across the dotted line, officially trading his entire future for a plate of steak. He smiled warmly at the man sitting across the table, completely unaware of the reality shifting beneath his feet. The benevolent protector gently placed the signed pages back into the dark briefcase. Jimmy thought he had just met his savior, but he had actually just shaken hands with his executioner. The golden ticket Jimmy had eagerly signed was not a passport to freedom, but a beautifully formatted eviction notice from his own life. Richard Sterling moved with the practiced grace of a seasoned caretaker, constructing a velvet fortress around his new prized possession. The isolation did not happen overnight through forceful demands or aggressive ultimatums. It crept in softly under the comforting guise of professional protection and intense creative focus. First went the casual childhood friendships back in the Rust Belt, which were immediately deemed too distracting for a rising pop star, with a grueling schedule. Then went his direct access to the outside world as Richard smoothly routed all communications through the shiny corporate office. Jimmy was told this was exactly how the biggest stars protected their precious mental energy from relentless public exhaustion. But what followed next was one of the darkest psychological swerves in the modern history of the competitive American music industry. The grand illusion of absolute artistic support was meticulously designed to violently sever every single tether anchoring Jimmy to reality. Richard understood that a lonely artist is a desperate artist who will cling to the only hand that feeds him. So he booked Jimmy into a windowless recording studio for 18 hours a day to capture the supposed magic. The boy was effectively buried alive under an avalanche of soundboards and discarded lyric sheets while the world spun outside. The true depth of this confinement crystallized on a freezing Thanksgiving night, while America retreated into warm family embraces. Jimmy sat alone in a dimly lit vocal booth, clutching a cup of cold coffee and staring at the silent microphones. 1,000 miles away in a sprawling Manhattan penthouse, bathed in city lights, Richard Sterling poured an expensive drink. The manager instructed studio engineers to keep the kid working through the holiday, citing an urgent production deadline. Jimmy believed he was making the ultimate sacrifice, while his manager enjoyed the luxurious fruits of blind loyalty. Back in the forgotten Rust Belt, a worried mother desperately dialed the very last emergency number she had for her missing son. The call bypassed the quiet studio entirely and rang directly on the private desk of Richard Sterling. Richard answered the phone with a chilling voice dripping in practiced empathy that could disarm almost anyone. He gently assured the crying woman Jimmy was surrounded by friends and too exhausted to speak. Before she could beg for just 1 minute of his time, Richard firmly hung up the phone. The connection was permanently severed in the cold silence of the penthouse, while a mother wept alone. Without missing a single beat, the manager swiftly dialed his telecommunications provider to permanently erase and replace the personal phone number of Jimmy Vance. The final rusted chain linking the young musician to his past identity and his supportive family had been cleanly snapped by a pair of silver pliers. Is this not the textbook definition of a hostage situation disguised as a platinum record deal? The boy in the booth was no longer a free citizen, chasing the glittering promise of eternal stardom. He had officially become the exclusive property of a ruthless warden, wearing a perfectly tailored suit and a reassuring smile. By the sweltering summer of the following year, the entire nation was relentlessly screaming the name of the Rust Belt prodigy. His debut single had mercilessly climbed the prestigious ranks of the Billboard Hot 100 chart. It completely dominated the American airwaves from the bustling streets of New York to the sunlit boulevards of Los Angeles. Jimmy was suddenly standing at the absolute pinnacle of the commercial music industry. Screaming fans eagerly chased his shiny tour bus across every major highway in the country. He was performing sold-out shows in massive stadiums that echoed with the deafening roar of relentless adoration. The flashing neon lights of the magnificent marquee spelled out his name in bold electric letters. He had seemingly conquered the insurmountable peak of the legendary American pop culture mountain. His youthful face smiled effortlessly from the glossy covers of countless esteemed music magazines. Everyone who looked at the glowing television screens believed they were witnessing the birth of a wealthy superstar. But the real secret is what happened when the blinding stadium lights finally powered down. While the relentless touring schedule was actively generating millions of dollars in gross revenue, Jimmy was quietly drowning in financial despair. The staggering contrast between his public perception and his private reality was absolutely breathtaking. He was celebrated as a reigning king on the spectacular stadium stages, but lived like an indentured servant behind closed doors. His personal bank account remained mysteriously empty despite the massive cultural phenomenon he had single-handedly ignited. The young artist could barely afford to purchase a decent meal after exhausting himself performing for tens of thousands of paying customers. Every single dollar flowing from ticket sales and expensive merchandise mysteriously vanished into the deep pockets of a shadowy corporate entity. He was a wildly famous ghost wandering through the lavish halls of his own magnificent musical empire. The grueling American dream had somehow materialized into a glittering nightmare of unimaginable proportions. How could a global icon with a diamond-certified record be virtually penniless? The devastating answer was quietly buried deep within that innocent stack of paper he had enthusiastically signed in the smoky diner. Down on page 42 of the labyrinthine contract, hidden beneath a formidable mountain of dense legal jargon, was a masterclass in exploitation. Richard Sterling had meticulously crafted a predatory clause designed to cleanly strip away every single ounce of intellectual property. The brilliant young musician had blindly traded his entire future for the fleeting warmth of a cheap meal and empty promises. Jimmy had absolutely no ownership over the brilliant melodies and deeply personal lyrics that were currently dominating the national culture. The contract legally categorized his immense creative genius as a simple work-for-hire arrangement under the ruthless corporate umbrella. Sterling expertly exploited the complicated loopholes of American copyright law to achieve absolute control over the highly lucrative master recordings. Whenever a major radio station proudly broadcasted the smash hit from coast to coast, the massive royalty checks bypassed the artist entirely. The lucrative licensing deals for television commercials and Hollywood movie soundtracks exclusively enriched the ruthless manager sitting in his lavish penthouse. Jimmy was legally prohibited from ever recording those specific songs again, without the explicit written permission of his powerful corporate master. The brutal mechanics of the music industry had systematically reduced a generational talent to a mere asset on a financial spreadsheet. Every single breathless cheer from the devoted audience only served to further enrich the very man who had stolen his creative soul. The crushing weight of this absolute exploitation finally hit the exhausted singer during a massive arena performance in the heart of Chicago. Jimmy slowly looked out at the endless sea of adoring faces passionately singing his deeply personal lyrics back to him in perfect unison. He finally realized in that heartbreaking moment that he had meticulously drawn the magnificent map to musical immortality with his own blood. But a calculating predator sitting comfortably in a distant corporate boardroom was growing impossibly rich by aggressively selling that exact map. The beautiful songs that had once provided a vital emotional escape from his impoverished childhood were now the heavy chains binding him. He was trapped in a spectacular golden cage, built entirely by his own breathtaking talent and sealed by his tragic naivety. The spectacular illusion of his glorious fame was flawlessly maintained for the merciless American public. But behind the glamorous velvet curtain, the tragic and slow destruction of a gentle artist had already begun. The world watched Jimmy spiraling into absolute madness across every major tabloid magazine cover. Grocery store checkout aisles were completely dominated by glossy photographs broadcasting his apparent moral decay. Paparazzi captured blurry images of him stumbling outside exclusive nightclubs with violently bloodshot eyes. The narrative felt tragically familiar to any eager consumer of modern American pop culture. A talented boy from the working class had supposedly been corrupted by sudden immense wealth. The general public eagerly consumed this spectacular downfall with a mixture of cruel fascination. Everyone assumed the immense pressure of Hollywood fame had finally shattered his fragile Midwestern psyche. They firmly believed he was merely another tragic cliché drowning in toxic celebrity hedonism. People shook their heads at the classic story of a pure talent ruined by excess. Gossip columns ruthlessly dissected his every mistake while completely ignoring the underlying systemic abuse occurring. The climax of this spectacle occurred inside a luxurious suite at the Chateau Marmont. Jimmy systematically destroyed priceless antique furniture and hurled a television set from the balcony. Sensationalized police reports described a chaotic scene of complete and utter rock and roll devastation. Richard Sterling stood before the blinding press cameras, looking like a deeply concerned father figure. He solemnly told eager reporters that his precious artist was battling terrible unseen personal demons. The manipulative manager expertly utilized the hungry tabloid press to paint himself as a savior. He carefully fed the sensationalist media machine just enough tragic details to maintain the frenzy. It was a chilling masterclass in manipulating public perception while completely obscuring the dark reality. Journalists devoured the fabricated narrative without questioning the underlying corporate motives. Many fans wept for a musical genius they believed was losing his mind. But here is where the manufactured story finally gets incredibly interesting for everyone. The highly publicized destructive behavior was never the result of a young artist losing his sanity. Those terrifying episodes of public violence were definitely not driven by a sudden crippling narcotics addiction. Jimmy Vance was completely sober during every single one of those heavily documented hotel tantrums. He had spent countless sleepless nights poring over the dense legal jargon of his suffocating contract. Hidden deep within that terrifying labyrinth of corporate exploitation was a very standard morality clause. The legal document clearly stated that severe public misconduct could trigger an immediate contract termination. Jimmy was definitely not experiencing a tragic psychological breakdown in front of the flashing cameras. He was actively trying to destroy his own reputation just to get himself legally fired. This brilliant but heartbreaking strategy was the only legal loophole available to a desperate prisoner. He willingly sacrificed his pristine character just to escape the invisible chains binding his life. He intentionally dismantled his pristine public image because it remained his only escape route. Every shattered hotel window and scripted drunken outburst was actually a desperate distress signal. He resembled a terrified trapped animal violently chewing off its own leg. But the brilliant legal machinery of the American entertainment industry was far too sophisticated. Richard Sterling harbored absolutely no intention of releasing his most profitable asset easily. The management company simply paid the expensive hotel damages using royalties stolen directly from Jimmy. The ruthless manager then weaponized those scandalous tabloid headlines to sell another million studio albums. The massive American media apparatus transformed a desperate hostage situation into a brilliant marketing campaign. Nobody ever recognized his carefully orchestrated public rebellion as a heartbreaking plea for absolute freedom. The system chewed him up and gladly swallowed the massive profits generated by his manufactured misery. His courageous rebellion was tragically repackaged as another lucrative piece of celebrity entertainment. The desperate cry for help was permanently silenced by the system. High above the crawling traffic of Manhattan, Richard Sterling swirled an expensive aged bourbon. His sprawling penthouse offered a godlike perspective over a city built on broken dreams. The ruthless manager stood quietly by the floor-to-ceiling windows, admiring the shimmering urban skyline. Down below, the relentless capitalist machine continued its endless consumption of fragile human art. Jimmy Vance had finally outlived his brief commercial utility to the sprawling corporate empire. The boy who once bled raw emotion into microphones was now simply a liability. Sterling did not feel any lingering sentimentality about dismantling the star he had built. The music industry rarely apologizes when it decides to butcher its exhausted golden calves. To the elite suits occupying these glass towers, musicians were merely temporary disposable assets. The true horror of this spectacular destruction lay in its absolute legal perfection. There would be no dramatic courtroom showdowns or tearful demands for delayed public justice. The 50 pages signed years ago in Los Angeles had already predetermined this outcome. Every devastating financial loss and creative theft was protected by perfectly drafted corporate loopholes. High-priced lawyers had carefully engineered a masterclass in exploitation that the law fully supported. Jimmy lost his name, his songs, and his entire recorded legacy overnight without recourse. The legal system of the United States heavily favors those who write the contracts. The establishment effectively penalized the working-class boy for daring to trust a wealthy stranger. A heartbreaking realization dawned upon those who bothered to read the final settlement terms. The contracts were practically designed to mathematically guarantee the eventual bankruptcy of the artist. The system was never genuinely broken. It functioned exactly as its wealthy architects intended. Every major record label essentially operates as a beautifully legalized form of modern servitude. They construct a dazzling maze of massive advances, recoupable expenses, and hidden distribution fees. The artists generate millions of dollars in revenue while remaining mathematically indebted to their masters. Sterling always understood that true power was never found standing under a bright spotlight. True power resided in the quiet boardrooms where artistic ownership was permanently stripped away. The public consumed the manufactured tragedy, while the executives quietly pocketed the massive profits. The establishment media always blamed the fragile artist for crumbling under the immense pressure. They completely ignored the parasitic executives draining the life out of the talent backstage. Jimmy was discarded onto the cold pavement of obscurity without a single financial safety net. The vibrant soul that once commanded massive stadium crowds had been completely hollowed out. He wandered the alien streets of a culture that had already forgotten his name. His acoustic guitar remained locked away, a silent witness to a profoundly tragic betrayal. The entertainment industry extracts the purest parts of an artist and leaves only shadows. This was not a spectacular fiery crash, but a slow, agonizing suffocation of talent. The tabloids had successfully painted him as a lunatic, perfectly shielding the corporate villain. People shook their heads at the fallen idol, completely blind to the invisible strings. The silence of his ruined career echoed loudly through the lonely valleys of California. But the real secret is entirely hidden from the adoring eyes of the public. The industrial machine never actually stops grinding, just because one single gear finally snaps. Before the ink on Jimmy's termination papers even dried, a new operation had commenced. Sterling calmly turned away from the breathtaking view and pressed a button on his desk. He instructed his junior assistant to book an immediate late-night flight back to the coast. The executive softly ordered the young scout to visit a specific rundown diner tonight. There were persistent rumors of another brilliant teenage songwriter playing for loose change there. The cycle of predatory wealth extraction demanded a continuous supply of naive human capital. The empire required fresh blood to keep its massive financial heart beating at peak performance. Somewhere out there, another desperate kid was currently staring into a bitter cup of coffee. That unknown teenager was silently praying for a miraculous escape from his crushing poverty. He had absolutely no idea that a man in a tailored suit was coming soon. The incoming executive would bring a warm smile and an incredibly thick legal document. The trap was already resetting itself under the neon glow of the great American night. A new golden goose was about to be fattened up for the eventual corporate slaughter. Sterling took a final satisfying sip of his bourbon and smiled at his own reflection. He had perfected the brutal art of turning raw teenage dreams into untraceable offshore wealth. Will the next vulnerable dreamer ever spot the smiling predator hiding in the dark shadows? The tragic trajectory of Jimmy Vance represents something far darker than a simple ruined career. He was the tragic architectural blueprint for a deeply predatory modern American entertainment machine. His vibrant talent was systematically extracted while the cold industry quietly moved onward without him. The boy from the fading Rust Belt never truly stood a chance against the corporate giants. We often romanticize the struggling artist without recognizing the ruthless mechanisms designed to consume them. Those beautifully crafted melodies we still sing along to were actually born from pure psychological torment. His broken spirit quietly paved the unfortunate way for generations of future trapped pop stars. The glamorous Hollywood dream was perfectly engineered to continuously exploit the most desperate working classes. Every shattered promise became another invisible brick in the towering walls of modern contract slavery. But the real secret is the vicious cycle did not end when his music stopped playing. The executives simply updated their legal paperwork and cast their nets out for new victims. Do you ever wonder why massive contemporary pop icons are constantly fighting inside crowded courtrooms? The invisible chains of the past remain securely fastened around the ankles of our brightest talents. Modern recording contracts are merely sophisticated digital versions of the exact same predatory agreements from before. The vulnerable laborers continue throwing their passionate souls into a machine that feels zero empathy. Behind every meticulously choreographed stadium tour lies a shadow of relentless financial and emotional extortion. We watch the sparkling performances while completely ignoring the invisible puppet strings controlling the stage. The devastating reality of American culture is that the wealthy elite almost never face consequences. Young dreamers arrive in Los Angeles with immense hope only to be drained of their essence. The ruthless managers sit comfortably in high skyscrapers while the broken artists eventually fade into obscurity. Our beloved entertainment industry thrives almost exclusively on the perpetual exploitation of the highly vulnerable. This beautifully packaged deception continues to generate billions of dollars for the invisible corporate overlords. The system flawlessly protects the powerful owners, while consistently leaving the actual creators with absolutely nothing. The tragedy of Jimmy Vance serves as a chilling reminder of the ultimate cost of fame. we must remember the human sacrifice hidden beneath the sparkling surface of our favorite contemporary hits. The heartbreaking cycle of exploitation will inevitably continue until the audience finally demands real structural change. His painful legacy whispers a desperate warning to every young kid playing a battered acoustic guitar. They are essentially walking into a glittering slaughterhouse while eagerly chasing the great American fantasy. The devastating silence following his final performance speaks volumes about the cruel nature of this business. He traded his absolute freedom for a golden cage that ultimately crushed his beautiful young spirit. The industry simply swept his shattered remains under the rug and happily introduced the next sensation. Every stolen royalty check represents a profound betrayal of the pure artistic passion he once held. The melody always survives the singer while the house always keeps the cold cash. Well, whatever your final opinion on this incredibly dark music industry history might actually be, the tragedy of Jimmy Vance still remains a chilling reminder of how the American dream can become a nightmare. We so often celebrate the glittering stage lights while completely ignoring the terrifying shadows cast right behind the curtains. The entertainment machinery has always been fueled by the raw innocence of young artists looking for a way out. But you really must wonder if anything has genuinely changed since those ruthless days of the Rust Belt. Are modern talent managers still operating the exact same blood-sucking playbook through shiny digital contracts? Some people argue that independent streaming gives musicians total control over their own artistic destinies. Others believe the exploitation just evolved into something infinitely more difficult to escape. The unseen traps might no longer be printed on physical paper inside a diner. The predatory tactics have simply migrated from dusty recording studios directly into complex online distribution agreements. Corporate executives in Manhattan penthouses are absolutely still finding brilliant new ways to feast on pure talent. Now listen carefully, because I really want to hear what you guys think about this entire situation. Tell me if you think artists today are truly safer from these industry vampires compared to the 80s stars. Drop your thoughts down there, because I will be reading through your brilliant perspectives and musical insights tonight. If you enjoyed diving into this history today, please hit that subscribe button for more crazy stories. I have honestly been your grateful host for today, and I will see you next time on the channel.